Hi, I'm Brad Culberson. I'm a data platform architect at Snowflake. I work out of the field CTO office. And I'm here with Mike. Mike, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name is Mike Timmerman. I'm a principal engineer at Snowflake, and I help design and build the Native Apps platform.
And today we're both going to talk about building and configuring secure Snowflake native applications. The agenda for today, we're going to start talking through the challenges to securing applications. We're going to talk about why Snowflake built the Native Application Framework. I'm going to go into the security for both providers and consumers. And then Mike's going to come in and show how this actually works from both a provider standpoint as well as a consumer standpoint. First, the challenges in the industry. Today, I want to start with the traditional software. This is software that you've purchased, you probably run on your infrastructure, you're running on your servers or your computers. The real challenges that we saw in the industry were just these not being updated. People were really afraid to patch and update their software. The providers and the software developers had no control over the hardware inside these systems. So it's very easy for end customers to reverse engineer their technology, as well as it was difficult to test because of the variety of hardware their software was getting deployed onto, as well as the builder having no access to telemetry. So these were running, out of their control, and it was very difficult to optimize as well as fix the software. The last point I wanted to point out is really just the concerns around security. That's what we're here to talk about today, is security. And customers are really concerned with what can these things do now that I'm running it on my servers or on my computers. The industry more recently has switched into software as a service. There's also some large security challenges whenever things have moved into SaaS products. And the real challenge here that we saw in the industry was around trust. And it's consumers having a lot of concerns around the provider and the builder having access to all of their data, which was required for SaaS to really work. This is just a huge risk to the end consumer because their data is no longer inside their infrastructure. It's difficult for them to stay compliant with all their legal and regulatory requirements. And just authenticating is very challenging because now this is yet another system that's out of their control that they have to authenticate into. So Snowflake built the Native App Framework. So I'll describe quickly on what it is. The Snowflake Native App Framework, it's a completely new stack of tools that allow you to build, distribute, deploy, operate, and monetize apps directly on our cloud, on the data cloud. What it is and how it works is it allows you to use traditional Snowflake objects and functionality packaged together into a unit that's a native application. You can then publish that on our marketplace directly, and then just monetize it directly inside of our infrastructure. End consumers then go to our marketplace. They can one-click install and run that directly inside the consumer's accounts. To summarize the benefits for both the providers and the customers, for the providers, this is an easy way to monetize, grow revenue, access a whole new market of Snowflake customers. And it also is just very quick because people are really used to leveraging Snowflake objects, and you can now just package those together, and all the skills you learn at Snowflake can now be leveraged for building applications. All of this is secured by our platform. We're securing both the data as well as the code. We talked through that a little bit later, and Mike's going to show you this in action. On the consumer side also, that we provide a lot of trust for these end users because they know exactly what the application is going to do. And it's all provided by one system, automatically one-click install, but the end consumer knows immediately what the application can and can't do, and they can have a lot of trust in what that application is doing. If you look at one of the principles we built the native application framework on top of was this concept of least privilege. And what I mean by that is these applications run as itself. It's not running as the role of the user who installed it. What's really nice about this, the application only has access to do things on what it creates during installation, what its requested privileges to work on, or what the administrator is giving them access to. So the application can't just automatically do anything. It's very obvious to the end consumer what that application is able to do. And this is something the end consumer can then trust because now the application doesn't run as the current user. It allows for high isolation of these applications because everybody knows exactly what they can do inside the system because they've granted it everything that it needed. On the provider side, I think one of the huge benefits of native applications is just this concept that they're all single tenant. I've worked at a lot of organizations where everything is multi-tenant. And if you look at the left side of this diagram, you get really nervous because in these multi-tenant applications, if there is a exploit, it's a potential risk that one tenant may actually gain access to another tenant's data. Inside of native applications, this is impossible because they're all single tenant installations, which means that one tenant, even if they somehow found an exploit inside the code, worst case scenario, they're still accessing their own data. That blast radius is really small. I'm going to talk just a bit about other advantages for the providers themselves. In this diagram, you can see how the provider is building the application, and that's shared through Marketplace to the consumer, and then it's running inside the consumer account. The consumers basically grant access to, can be granted access to execute this code. So it deploys from the Marketplace. It then is running inside the consumer account, but the consumers can't see any of the code. They only are granted access to execute it. For data, it's also well secured. Data access can be granted to the consumer and or the application. So if the application needs access to other data inside the consumer account, the consumer's application administrator is granting that. So it's very obvious what data it can access. We use Anaconda. I think it's great because this is a list of trusted Python packages and curated packages that are all kept up to date and patched. And this is just a trusted list that you can tap into to know that you're building a secure application. And it'll be continuously patched for you. All code that goes into applications are automatically scanned by our security team. So anytime you're publishing your application in Marketplace, it's going to go through a security audit to make sure that there's nothing malicious in there. And that both protects the provider as well as the consumer. The upgrades are always pushed by the provider. Earlier, I talked about how this was something very difficult in traditional software of applications just getting out of date. What's beautiful about our system is upgrades are pushed by the provider exactly like Snowflake does. They're always up to date. As a provider, if you patch something and it needs to get deployed, you're in control over that deployment. And also, I talked a bit about the observability of these applications and how traditional applications, there was just no real insight into what was happening. In the Native App Framework, the consumer can grant all the event log access to the provider. This is often used for debugging or for issues that are happening inside the system. But the consumer can opt in to say, I'm going to share that data back to the provider. Mike's going to show this in action later also. Now we're going to go into what this looks like for the consumer. And really, the first part I would look at is just how is the data kept in their control and how do they have sovereignty over their data? How is this trust on their data something that is better than all other software patterns that we've seen historically? And it really is around the way we've secured data. The application really must be granted access to any data that the consumer wants it to have access to. Just because I'm a user and I happen to have account admin and I use the application does not mean the application can actually see any of that data. It must have been granted direct access to that data by the administrator. The data stays entirely inside the consumer's account also. So the provider has no access to this data. It's not moving. There's no transformation processes. There's no data sharing back to the provider. So it stays secured. It stays completely inside the consumer's control. And as I mentioned earlier, all of this is always up to date. So the consumer can just have a lot of comfort in knowing if there has been a bug release and if there has been any type of security exploits that have been patched. It's automatically been deployed in their system. They don't have to worry about talking to an IT administrator to go get their systems patched or upgraded and then worry about the lag time associated because the consumer will automatically get those updates. And next up, we have Mike to really show this in action. So everything I talked about was conceptual. Mike's going to show the code for actually how to do this in action from both a provider as well as a consumer standpoint.
Thanks, Brad. All right, so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to walk you through kind of the different security primitives that you can use as a provider and show them in action. And then I'm going to show you what these things look like when they're running in a consumer's account. Now, for the purposes of our demo, we're going to be working with the Chairlift app. This is an application that's being developed by Snowflake and is available as a quick start if you'd like to play with it yourself. But as a quick overview, the premise behind the application is that as a provider, you are a manufacturer of chairlifts. You sell these things to ski resorts. Your consumers are actual ski resorts who have installed this application, and they are uploading their sensor data into their Snowflake account. And your application allows them to both visualize this sensor data as well as warn the user when there is a potential failure coming up in their chairlift. So if you recognize a pattern with a particular sensor, the application will warn the user and the user can schedule maintenance with you as a provider. Now, as far as the actual architecture of the app, we have both kind of the provider and the consumer side shown here. And as you can see on the left side where the provider information is, we have the application package, and we have a bunch of data inside the provider's account, right? The sensor threshold information is in that sensor types table. And we also have a multi-tenant table that has all the appointment data for all of your various consumers. On the right side, we have the consumer's installed application. And one of the things Brad said, of course, is that applications can do nothing inside of your account, right? But here we see an application. It's both selecting through the application package to get at that sensor data or the sensor threshold data. And it's also selecting sensor reading data out of the consumer's database. So we're going to talk about that, right? What we're going to go through here is we're going to talk about how you as a provider configure your logging, how a consumer chooses or does not choose to share it back to you. Then we're going to go through how an application requests account level privileges. We're going to talk about how an application requests, binds, and executes using references. And then finally, we're going to talk about how you as a provider control the public API of your app, right? All the different objects in your app and which ones you choose to expose into the consumer's account. So starting off with the log data, the first thing we're going to see is that as a provider, you control the log level, right? You've written all the code, you've emitted all of your log lines, and you choose in your manifest file what log level you want the app to emit at. So if you don't want to divulge potentially sensitive information, you could choose to set your log level to warning or error when you're distributing your application. That said, all of these log lines that are emitted are going to show up in the consumer's event table. They will be shown up as individual events in the event table. And the consumer has the control as to whether or not they're willing to share that back to you as a provider. So as a consumer, you can issue the DEL statement shown at the bottom of this slide, and that will cause the events to both be written to the consumer's event table and to the provider's event table inside their own events account. Moving on to account level privileges, as we said, the application can do nothing other than work with the objects that it has created inside of itself. Now, you can see here we have a very small list of privileges you can ask for at the moment. And in the case of the Chairlift app, the thing it needs is it needs to be able to run a background task. The background task's purpose is to query the sensor readings, to look for anomalies, and then create warnings to alert the user of potential problems in their installed Chairlift. And the way you ask for this privilege as a provider, or the way you define that your application needs it, is again by specifying it as part of your manifest file. So you can see here on the right, we have a privileges section, and we have specifically asked for execute task, and we've described why we need it. Now, you can also choose to have Snowsite or Snowflake in our Snowsite UI prompt the user with a dialog box that will have them grant or potentially deny the privilege. So if you are using the Streamlit for your UI, you can use the SDK that we've developed called, you can see here, snowflake.permissions, and you can execute a function that will prompt the user to grant the privilege to the application. Now, here we've done it inside of a button, but this is not actually a required pattern. This is just what we happen to have done for the Chairlift app, and I'll show you that in action in just a few minutes. Now, finally, or the next thing we want to go through, of course, is references. And there are multiple steps to working with references. The first thing you need to do as a provider is you need to define, again, the list of references that your application will need in the consumer's account. So there are multiple references as part of the Chairlift app. I've only selected 2 of them here to show off. But you can see here we have a reference defined called sensor readings, right? And the text here matters, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We have a list of privileges that this reference needs. We have an object type, it's a table, and we have a callback function that we have defined, and we're going to talk about that and how that works in just a second as well. And just to show you a different example, we also have a second reference here, which is the warehouse type. And in this case, this is the warehouse that the application will use to run that background task that I was talking about. Now, after you've declared these references, you need to actually prompt for them, just like with the application level privileges. So again, if you're using Streamlit, you can use the permissions SDK and you can actually cause Snowsight to pop up a UI in front of the user that will allow them to bind the references for you. So in this case, we have a button, and again, you don't need to use a button, but we've chosen to in this for our particular application. And you can see we're calling request reference to make that work. Now, after the user has bound that reference, the next thing that happens is the UI is going to call your callback function, which I was talking about earlier. So this is in our setup SQL file as part of the application. And this is the actual callback function that we have, and it looks relatively boilerplate. But the reason why this is here and why this is really powerful is that as a provider, you can intercept these references being bound, and you can choose to take action based on which references are bound. So for example, if after binding the sensor data table, you want to immediately kick something off, you can do that. And we haven't done that here. It's very straightforward, but this is what that looks like. And then finally, of course, you need to actually use these things in your code. So when you declare a SQL statement that you want to run, you can actually now use a function called, you can see here, reference, and you pass in a string for the reference you want to resolve. And of course, that string again comes back to the name that was defined in your manifest file. So this is, you can see here on the second line of this statement, we have select max from reference. And then further down, we insert into a reference as well. And in this case, both references are for a table. So that's why that is what it is. Now, finally, we move on to your public interface of your application. And as I was saying before, you get to control the interface of your app. Nothing that you create in your app is actually visible to a single role in the consumer's account. Even account admin can't see the artifacts that are inside your application. So what you have to do as an application provider is in your setup script, you have to create application roles. And then you have to choose which things you want to grant access, or which of the things in your application you want to grant to these roles, and which privileges you want those roles to have. So in the case of the Chairlift app, there are actually two roles. And what I've shown here is one of those roles, and I've shown granting usage on the UI schema. And again, we'll show you what that looks like in the consumer's account in just a minute. But the actual artifacts in the Chairlift app, this is a list of all the different things that are being created by the Chairlift setup script. And you can see we have a UI schema, which is actually granted to both roles. We have a dashboard Streamlit and a sensor data Streamlit, also granted to both roles. And then we have a configuration Streamlit, which is only granted to app admin. We also have a stored procedure and a couple of tables that are granted to app admin, and everything else inside this app is not granted. These are things that are used internally by the task or by the Streamlit UI in order to make the application work. And they're not things that a consumer needs to actually be able to see or touch, and we don't want them to. So with that, I'm going to move on to the consumer, and I'm going to show you what it looks like as a consumer that's actually working with the Chairlift app. All right, so here we are inside of a consumer's account, and they've installed the Chairlift app. Now, just for full transparency, what we've done is we've created two account level roles, one called Chairlift Admin, which is being assigned the app admin application role. And we have the Chairlift Viewer role, which is being assigned the application viewer role. So I just want to show you quickly what it looks like if you're a Chairlift viewer. Remember, I was saying before, the only thing that was granted was the UI schema, so we can see it here. And unfortunately, Streamlits don't show up in the Object Explorer, but you'll have to trust me that they're there, and I will show you that in just a minute. And then if we switch to App Admin instead, here's the Chairlift Admin, you can see again, we don't see the UIs, but we do see the things under Warnings, Data, and we do see the things under Config Code, etc. Right? All of these things that you can actually see and touch and work with, they're visualized here. But I think more interesting is if we go into that actual configuration experience. And I'm going to do this as the Chairlift admin for now. So here we go. We're loading our Streamlit. And before I actually click the button here that's going to cause things to pop up, I do want to point out everything we're working with is actually visible under this shield up here that is provided by Snowflake. So if I click on the security shield, I can see that this app was installed 5 hours ago. It would like to have execute task as an account level privilege. It also has a whole bunch of references that it would like us to find. So if I go back here, and I could theoretically click the buttons in there, but I'm going to use the actual buttons in our Streamlit. And you can see here, this is causing that shield to pop up and say that we would like to bind this particular reference. So in this case, I'm going to go in service requests, and I'm going to select my table, and I'm going to grant it. And say save, and you can see that's there. And now it says that it needs to actually have a warehouse or a warnings generation table. So here we go. We need to grant usage on the warehouse, and this is the warehouse we need. We need the list of machines that you have installed at your ski resort. So under chairlift data, I have my machines table. Then we have the sensors, the list of actual sensors that have data being collected from those particular machines. Whoops. Yeah. And then finally, we also have the sensor readings table. So this is all of the actual data that's coming out of your sensors. And then finally, we have this account level privilege that we want to ask for. So we request that privilege as well. And you can see execute task, grant privilege. And then it says you've done your first time setup, continue to the app. So we do that. Now, more interesting perhaps is if I load the sensor data, you're going to see all of it show up here in just a second. There we go. It's pulling up the charts, and you can see everything's being rendered. And the background task will kick in and generate a bunch of warnings, but I don't really want to go through that right now. Going back over here, though, remember I mentioned before that sorry, I don't know if you did catch that or not. There are 3 tabs up here. There's dashboard, configuration, and sensor data. If I come in here as the chairlift viewer role and I launch my app, now the configuration tab is missing. So again, this is that visibility control that you have as a developer defining your public API. And then finally, I think one of the other things that's relevant to a developer and also to a consumer is the fact that if you were to go as account admin and look at the account activity, you'll actually see that in query history, the SQL text of the various things being run by the application is redacted. Interestingly enough, also, you'll find that all of the contents of the stored procedure in the app, even though they will show up as stored procedures that are in the system, the actual stored procedure method bodies are completely redacted as well. And this is to protect the provider's code from the consumer. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Mike. It's really cool seeing how both as a provider and a consumer, we've built a framework that allows you to secure both your code from a provider standpoint, as well as being able to build something that consumers can trust to install inside their application. I'm sure you're able to follow all that code that Mike just walked through, but if not, we do have a couple of resources online that you should check out. The first I'd suggest is the chairlift application itself. So everything Mike showed earlier is available online, so please go look at that. That's available in our quick starts. And also we have a native app bootcamp that goes through all of these same concepts also and shows how to really build a secure application directly on top of Snowflake. Thanks for your time today. I've really enjoyed talking with you. If you have any questions, please reach out to your account teams at Snowflake and we'll help out. Thanks.